Hey guys, my name is Alex and this is the Revolutionary Male. I'm going to go ahead and read you an article from Quillette.com entitled On Toxic Femininity by Heather E. Haying, published on 9th of July 2018. A couple of videos. I've done a couple of videos now. I think this may be the second or third, I'm not sure, on toxic femininity as a concept. And because I would like to address this issue of toxic masculinity and toxic femininity more broadly, as honestly like poor concepts. So I'm going to go ahead and do that again here with this article. This one is a little more interesting. I'll let some stuff I'll agree with and some stuff I disagree with. So it'll be interesting to find out exactly what that looks like. And I hope you enjoy the content here. All right, beginning the article. Male lions can be monsters, murderous and focused, toxic, if you will. Given the opportunity, male lions will kill the kittens in a pride over which they have gained control. They commit infanticide, which brings the new mothers, freshly childless, back into estrus. The females are then quickly impregnated. This, we can all agree, is disturbing behavior and may make some people feel rather less pleased with lions. I would say no, pardon me. They're just lions being lions. Imposing morality onto animal behavior is kind of silly, especially animal behavior like, lower level mammals. We're not talking about even chimps or bonobos or gorillas, higher level mammals with social dynamics more akin to what it's like in human society. Continuing, given the opportunity, the vast majority of modern human males would do no such thing. Good, I agree. Those who argue that men are inherently toxic are, ironically, making arguments that are biologically essentialist. That is true. And they are making them badly at that. Evolution built humans as it did lions, but humans have longer childhoods and greater generational overlap, share more ideas with greater complexity, and usually live in more stable social groups than do lions. In humans, evolution has given us the capacity to shape personality during development to a greater degree than any other species. As such, and because few human cultures would tolerate such behavior, the vast majority of men would not and could not kill babies nor rape their grieving mothers. Over 30 years ago, I came of age as a female in LA. Being a young woman in LA means being watched for deviations from the norm, for indications of future fame, for signs of weakness. I would imagine it's very, very similar for lots of men too. It's Hollywood, clearly. Watched simply for how one looks. Again, men experience this too. There are, unfortunately, many examples, recent and not, that point to LA's most famous industry being a place where young women need to be on guard. I never aspired to the industry, but even just living in LA, the culture is omnipresent. 2 anecdotes should suffice. Walking alone in my sun-kissed West LA neighborhood one summer, I was approached by a man looking for extras for a beach scene in a movie. Before I had said a word, he told me where to go, how much I would be paid per day, and what would be expected of me. That I stand around in a bikini among others similarly clad. I told him I was going to college. He literally looked me up and down, adopted a frown, and assured me that I did not need to go to college. Beach scenes were my future, and from there, who could say? Better beach scenes, presumably. Big deal. A talent agent, scout, saw you on the street and asked you to come over and do some work because you were a pretty woman. No big deal. Men experience the same stuff. Second anecdote. One of my many part-time jobs in high school, along with scooping ice cream and renting out VHS tapes, was staffing high-end catering events. Dressed in classic tailored black and white, I carried platters of hors d'oeuvres around the cocktail hour and ferried plated entrees during table service. At indoor events, male attendees would often stop me to engage in small talk and ask for my number. I wished that they wouldn't, but I felt no risk. One night, though, I worked at an event on the back lot of Universal Studios. A group unaffiliated with Hollywood had booked it for a no-expenses-spared fate, and I was to do the usual, except that I would have to cover more ground. The kitchen was further away, the guests more spread out, with no walls to contain them. Before table service, my coworkers and I made the rounds with our platters of bruschetta and cured meats. On this Hollywood backlot, though, the lack of walls proved dangerous. A young man, older than me but younger than 30, maneuvered me away from the crowd. There were many shadows, and he stood too close. He looked at me with predatory eyes. He backed me into a hedge, rubbed up against me, and I got away from him before it went any further. That is a terrible story. obviously, and I sympathize greatly with her experience. Nobody should ever do anything like that to anyone. She continues, that was toxic masculinity before the phrase existed. Again, I used to have some sympathy for this terminology because it was originally used to call out bad behavior like this, but now I think it has been weaponized to pathologize male behavior and men generally. And I think that's what she's going to say next. That was toxic masculinity before the phrase existed. Yes, toxic masculinity exists. I would rephrase that to say, yes, bad behavior exists. There's nothing to do with masculinity. But the use of the term has proved weaponized. It is being hurled without care at every man. When it emerged, its use seemed merely imprecise. In most groups of people, there's some guy waiting for an opportunity to fondle a woman's ass without her consent. Put his hand where he shouldn't, right? That's who is being outed as toxic. Those men, and far, far worse, do exist, obviously. But wait, does every human assemblage contain such men? It does not. This term, toxic masculinity, is being wielded indiscriminately and with force. We are not talking imprecision now. We are talking thoroughgoing inaccuracy. Most men are not toxic. Their maleness does not make them toxic, any more than one's whiteness makes one racist. Exactly. Assume for the moment that we could agree on terms. Is maleness more highly correlated with toxic masculinity than is femaleness? Yes. Ipso facto, the term is about maleness, so men will display more of it than will women. The logical leap is then concluding that all men are toxic. The very communities where toxic masculinity is being discussed most are the communities where the men are, in my experience, compassionate, egalitarian, and not at all toxic. That's my experience as well. In fact, most of the time, the people at whom, shouldn't say most of the time, a lot of the time, the people at whom this crap is hurled is men like me, men who are interested in helping people, helping women, helping men. And instead, we are labeled as toxic. It's quite unfair. And to claim, I'm sorry, but to claim that merely your race or your sexual identity makes you one thing or another is kind of in and of itself racist and sexist. Continuing the article, calling good men toxic does everyone a deep disservice. Everyone except those who seek empowerment through victim narratives. Okay, let me read that again. Calling good men toxic does everyone a deep disservice. I agree with that. Everyone except those who seek empowerment through victim narratives. That's interesting. I'm not sure exactly what she's going to say next. Let's go on. For the record, I am not suggesting that actual victims do not exist. Okay, now I see what she's saying. She's saying that there are some people who are trying to seize certain social power by using victim narratives in order to do it. All right. For the record, I am not suggesting that actual victims do not exist, nor that they do not deserve full emotional, physical, legal, medical, and other support. I also do not want to minimize the fact that most women, perhaps even all, have experienced unpleasantness from a subset of men. And most men have experienced unpleasantness from a subset of women. I can tell you stories about my own experiences. Trust me, every man's got them. We just don't live in a society where men are encouraged to share this kind of information and talk about it. But not all women are victims. And even among those women who have truly suffered at the hands of men, most, I would hazard to guess, do not want their status in the world to be victim. All of which leads us directly to a topic not much discussed, toxic femininity. Again, a concept that I think only should be used when responding to arguments about toxic masculinity, so that you can use them to batter each other, to point out how ridiculous both concepts are. Because really we're just talking about bad behavior. The behavior is toxic or dangerous or destructive or predatory, not the feminine or the masculine. Sex and gender roles have been formed over hundreds of thousands of years in human evolution. Indeed, over hundreds of millions of years in our animal lineage. Aspects of those roles are in rapid flux, but ancient truths still exist. Historical appetites and desires persist. Straight men will look at beautiful women, especially if those women are young and hot and actively displaying. Display invites attention. Yes, exactly. It's biological. When men, heterosexual men like myself, see young, beautiful women, it is very much a physical reaction that we can't help but look and admire and appreciate their beauty. Hotness amplifying femininity puts on a full display, advertising fertility and urgent sexuality. It invites male attention by, for instance, revealing flesh or by painting on signals of sexual receptivity. This, I would argue, is inviting trouble. No, I did not just say that she was asking for it. I did, however, just say that she was displaying herself, and of course she was going to get looked at. I agree with this concept. I agree with the concept that you only have control over yourself. And as a woman, your job to protect yourself part of your job is to minimize risk. And you can minimize risk by dressing certain ways. And a lot of women in today's culture dress in ways that grab attention, which is their absolute right to do. But then you can't complain just because you get attention that you might not necessarily want. You have to learn as an adult how to handle attention you don't want, men and women alike. It's part of growing up and becoming an adult and learning how to manage conflict resolution. The amplification of hotness is not, in and of itself, toxic, although personally I don't respect it and never have. Hotness fades. Wisdom grows. Wise young women will invest accordingly. Femininity becomes toxic when it cries foul, chastising men for responding to a provocative display. I think that's fair. Where we set our boundaries is a question about which reasonable people might disagree, but two bright lines are widely agreed upon. Every woman has the right not to be touched if she does not wish to be, and coercive quid pro quo, in which sexual favors are demanded for the possibility of career advancement, is unacceptable. But when women doll themselves up in clothes that highlight sexually selected anatomy and put on makeup that hints at impending orgasm, it is toxic. Yes, toxic, to demand that men do not look, do not approach, do not query. I think that's perfectly fair. I agree that coercive quid pro quo relationships in the workplace are dangerous and destructive and predatory. I believe that everyone has the right to not be touched if they don't want to be touched. But I also agree that as women, you have a responsibility, as adult women, to know that when you go out and you display yourselves sexually, you have a responsibility to accept the fact you're asking for attention, and you know that you are, and so you're going to get it. And in order to actually be an adult, you have to learn how to handle that attention. Especially when that attention comes from men you don't want it from. All right. Young women have vast sexual power. Yes, they do. And women have always had power. Sexual power, social power, family power. They just haven't had the same kind of societal, socioeconomic, and political power as men have. Everyone who is being honest with themselves knows this. Women in their sexual prime, who are anywhere near the beauty norms for their culture, have a kind of power that nobody else has. They are also all but certain to lack the wisdom to manage it. Toxic femininity is an abuse of that power, in which hotness is maximized and victim status is then claimed when straight men don't treat them as peers. I think that is perfectly fair. Absolutely perfectly fair. You have power. You use that power, you abuse that power, and then you claim to be a victim because you get attention from a man you don't want it to give it to you. That is toxic. Creating hunger in men by actively inviting the male gaze, then demanding that men have no such hunger, that is toxic femininity. Subjugating men, emasculating them when they display strength, physical, intellectual, or otherwise, that is toxic femininity. Insisting that men, simply by virtue of being men, are toxic, and then acting surprised as relationships between men and women become more strained, that is toxic femininity. It is a game, the benefits of which go to a few, while the costs are shared by all of us. And I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree that this concept of toxic masculinity is just a way to pathologize male behavior and men generally. It's only causing more strife and strain and conflict between men and women. It isn't helping at all. If it was originally intended to help, which it may have been, it's not helping anymore. All it is doing now is causing problems. Because while we're asked as men to change this and to change that and change this and change that, we're not actually allowed a voice in the conversation, to express ourselves, to be honest about how we feel. And so this supposed dialogue about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, it's not a dialogue, it's a monologue. And only the women are allowed to speak. And that's not how you solve problems. Continuing now. I had a student on one of my study abroad trips who had a perennial problem with clothing. She was never wearing enough of it. She was smart, athletic, and beautiful, but also intent on advertising hotness at all moments. At a field station in a jungle in Latin America, she approached me to complain that the local men were looking at her. The rest of us were wearing field gear, a distinctly unrevealing and unsexy garb. She was in a swimsuit. Put more clothes on, I told her. She was aghast. She wanted me to change the men, to talk to them about where to point their eyes. Here in their home, where we were visitors, and one of the gringos had shown up nearly naked, and she wanted the men to change. See how entitled that is? And this is the mindset of a lot of women now. They do this, they provoke, they do things that they know are going to get a reaction, and then they blame those who react for reacting in the first place. Even in a place where she doesn't belong, or where she is not, it's not her place. It's not her home. She doesn't live there. She's not from there. It's not her community. She has no right to waltz into there and tell those men how they should and shouldn't behave. This is the kind of entitled behavior that a lot of us men are dealing with out in the world now when it comes to women. And it's nice to see, another woman recognize this. For a spell before that, my job was to trek around tropical forests studying poison frogs. I was interested in their sex lives and figuring out how they choose their mates in their territories, and how they parent, and what that meant about the evolution of sociality more generally. My research revealed, in part, how many different ways there are to be territorial and to be successful. In male frogs, specifically in male frogs. In Madagascan poison frogs, there are multiple routes to success, both naturally and sexually selected. Males can succeed evolutionarily by holding high-quality territories, and they can also succeed by having no territories at all, but by rather being more sneaky. Wide variance in strategy and shifting strategies under different conditions is well studied in animal behavior and game theory. Given that we know this to be true in non-human animals, why would we imagine that humans are less, rather than even more flexible? There are many ways to be female and many ways to be male, and some of each are bad news for everyone, but the individual employing them. As a social species that has become the dominant ecological force on our planet, we can and should aspire to behave in ways that are not merely selfish, not merely competitive, but also collaborative. Toxic masculinity and toxic femininity are inherently selfish modes, and those not employing them should be interested in seeing them eradicated. I wholeheartedly agree with that. She continues, the movement that has popularized the term toxic masculinity shares tools and conclusions with those who see signs of white supremacy everywhere they look. Intersectionalists have in common with one another a particular rhetorical trick. Any claim made by a member of an historically oppressed group is unquestionably true. Questioning claims is itself an act of oppression. This opens the door for anyone who is willing to lie to obtain power. If you cannot question claims, any claim can be made. And I agree with that. I agree that there are lots of opportunists out there who are going to be willing to take advantage of these kinds of arguments and use them to destroy people. Thus, racism is ubiquitous. All men are toxic. I object, but objection is not allowed. Everyone who understands game theory knows how this game ends. Innocent people being vilified with false claims and exposed to witch hunts. Sexual assault is real, but that does not mean that all claims of sexual assault are honest. It is shocking that this bears saying, but there is a world of men who are smart and compassionate and eager to have vibrant, surprising conversations with other people, both men and women. The sex-specific toxicity that I have seen, when it has been obvious, has mostly been in the other court. All men are toxic and all women are victims? No, not in my name. Thank you, Heather. I would like to thank you for writing this article. Heather E. Hang is a former professor of evolutionary biology at the Evergreen State College. She has a PhD in biology from the University of Michigan. Thank you very much, Heather. I appreciate this, and I'm sure men everywhere, kind, decent, compassionate men like myself, appreciate this kind of woman standing up for us and standing up for real victims of sexual assault and violence. And against a lot of this nonsense out here that is culture, that everything is misogyny, that everything is hate for women, everything is sexism. It's not. I think we lose a lot in translation when we start just seeing enemies everywhere. That's the end of that article, gentlemen, and any ladies who are watching. If you enjoy the video, go ahead and leave me a like. comment below if you have anything to say. If you have any questions or would like to send me any stories, either news articles or even your own personal stories, you can go ahead and email me at therevolutionarymail@gmail.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I will share everything I can that I'm allowed to, that you let me share here on the channel. That's all for today. My name is Alex. This has been the Revolutionary Male, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. It won't turn off.